On today's show, we'll be joined by weekly co-host Ben DuBose to discuss the encouraging signs from this Houston Rockets loss on the second night of a back-to-back to the best team in the NBA, the Boston Celtics. The Rockets made this a competitive game. Jalen Green, struggling big time in the first half, exploded in the third quarter to balance his night back out. Kevin Porter Jr., 9 assists, 0 turnovers, looking incredibly locked in over these past couple games. All that and more coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start.
The Houston Rockets select Jalen Green and Jabari Smith Jr.
T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal.
Every time I step on that floor, I'm coming.
You're getting somebody who's going to come in with a chip on their shoulder, somebody who's going to come in and compete from day one.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays, host of the State of the Rockets podcast, as well as Rockets Watch. Be sure to follow along on Twitter at JT Gatlin. The show, of course, at Locked On Rockets, free and available wherever you get your podcasts, including YouTube, where you can help the show out tremendously by commenting anything below. Remember, for the house, for the team, for the algorithm. Go drop me a comment on YouTube. I read each and every one of those every single day. Joining us now is none other than your weekly co-host, the Podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor, and also the host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can follow on Twitter at Ben DuBose. Here to talk about Rockets on the second night of a back-to-back. And Ben, look, I went into this game with very low expectations, given the fact that they're coming off a big win in Chicago against the Bulls, a game in which Jalen and KPJ and Alp all played phenomenally, but one of the best games, if not the best game that we've seen those three play together. I thought they were walking into like a schedule loss against the Boston Celtics. They did ultimately lose this game, but I think the process by which they lost and how hard they fought against the best team in the NBA was really, really encouraging.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot negative to say about the process tonight. Obviously, it stings to lose by 24 points. But look, you're playing the best team in the NBA on night 2 of a road back-to-back. And what ended up happening, the Rockets just ran out of gas in the second half. The Celtics scored 70 points. And on a night where both Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown have it going, it's going to be very tough to keep up the requisite effort for 4 quarters. And it really felt like after Jalen Green had that breakthrough third quarter, 18 points and 7 of 9 shooting, he started to fatigue a little bit, which is understandable. And once he wasn't still at that superhuman level, at some point the dam was going to break, and it did, especially on a night when both Tatum and Brown had 6 3-pointers apiece. So you tip your hat to them, but this was a game in which it wasn't like the Rockets' process was really flawed in any way. I think it's really, when you look at the box score, number one, it's tough to beat the NBA's best team when you're one of the youngest and last place in the Western Conference, period. And certainly, a lot of times this year we talk about inefficiency from Jalen Green or Kevin Porter Jr. That did not happen tonight. They had a combined 50 points on nearly 50% shooting. Porter Jr. had 9 assists to 0 turnovers. Really, the only sort of low points that I would point to would be Alperen Sengun and Jabari Smith Jr. But honestly, some of it is just understandable. And those are guys that, quite frankly, you have to ride with, and sometimes they're going to have rough nights. Sengun had 25 and 11 in Chicago. Tonight, he did not score in 20-plus minutes, went 0 of 3. To me, the Celtics are just a tough matchup for him, and I went and looked back in writing my story for Rockets Wire. Sengun actually struggled against the Celtics last year as well, shot just 36% from the field in the 2 meetings against them, and he averaged 5 fouls in 20 minutes. And it makes sense when you think about it, because the Celtics are the type of team, offensively, they just have so much off-ball movement that they can really punish someone like Sengun. It's not a traditional rim protector, and his processing speed at times can still be a little bit slow. And then when the Rockets are on offense and the Celtics are on defense, the Celtics have the type of bigs with Al Horford and Robert Williams. You're not going to fool them. What Sengun does a lot of the time is sort of he uses players' aggressiveness against them. He's so smart. He's so ahead of the curve offensively. And the Celtics are just the one team, well, not the one team, but one of the only teams that it's tough to do that against. So I think it's just a rough matchup for him. And there's probably some fatigue as well after playing so well in Chicago. And then Jabari Smith Jr., look, the bottom line, he's just not making threes right now. You look at his last 6 games going in, he was barely above 20%. He was 2 of 7 tonight. This is different than early in the year. We saw that graph last night where he was shooting below 20% from mid-range in October, mid-30s in November, about 50% in December. This isn't that. Right now, his struggles are just because he's not making his threes. We have a long track record that suggests that should turn around. It's annoying that it happens right now. But the bottom line is, to win at Boston, especially with the fatigue issues, you needed not just a great showing from Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. You needed your role players, your supporting cast like Alperen Sengun and Jabari Smith to step up. It didn't happen. And again, I just have a tough time getting that upset about it. It's understandable given the schedule. And you even had the extra perk of TyTy Washington playing well off the bench instead of Jae'Sean. So as I see it, the positives clearly outweigh the negatives because, again, with Sengun, I think it's understandable. And with Jabari Smith Jr., it's just a matter of time until that three-point shot comes around again.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely think many encouraging signs from this one. I think some of the gripes, are maybe warranted about, especially Sengun. Just, it's not something I want to dig into a little bit later on. Just the 22 minutes, 0-3 from the floor. I want to talk about that, kind of his performance in this game specifically, and kind of the differences and the stark contrast from how he played against the Bulls in the first night of the back-to-back to then how he was utilized here against this Celtics team. And some of that is, I think, how he was deployed, but also some of it to do with the matchup specifically against the Celtics. But I think, the guy here, your Locked on Rockets player of the game, Jalen Green. He had an abysmal start to this game. He was 3 turnovers in the first quarter. It was 2 of 7, 2 of 8 shooting at one point early in the game. Just a really, really rough all-around performance out of the gate. Was missing some easy shots, was settling for some bad three-pointers, and we saw him completely turn his night around in that third quarter. Had 18 points on 7 of 9 shooting in that third frame. And I think that's kind of probably the most encouraging sign from this game, maybe on par with also Kevin Porter Jr., the 9 assists to 0 turnovers in this game was really, really nice to see. But Jalen, seeing that he had such a bad first half and then being able to rebound there in the second half on his way to finishing with 28 points on 22 shots, was wound up finishing 3 of 11 from long distance, did have a couple of assists. I thought that was really great to see him kind of dig himself out of that rough start and finish with a strong game, especially how well he played in that third quarter.
Mm-hmm. 2 quick thoughts on those guys. With Kevin Porter Jr., I was listening before the game to the new the Low Post podcast with Zach Lowe and Tim McMahon talking about the James Harden bombshell rumor that everybody knows. If you're listening to Locked on Rockets, you know what Woj reported on Christmas regarding Harden and the Rockets. And Tim made the point, of course, Tim is well plugged in Houston, one of the teams that he covered closely, that Kevin Porter Jr., since that rumor, which undoubtedly raised a few eyebrows in the Rockets locker room, Kevin Porter Jr. has been locked in because, of course, if James Harden were to come, he would be taking Kevin Porter's current job as the starting point guard. So I don't know if that will last the remainder of this season, but so far so good. Tim was speculating that maybe this sort of lit a fire under Kevin. So far so good. He's been really good in these 2 games to start this road trip in Chicago and Boston. As far as Jalen, what's interesting to me, he didn't really shoot that well from 3 tonight, 3 of 11, but he was still 50% overall shooting. Of course, the third quarter was the biggest reason why. Sometimes I wonder if we underestimate the mental aspect of him sort of learning to score at this level. We talk a lot about sort of strength when it comes to him finishing on his drives and getting more balance on his threes. I think an underrated part of sort of the transition for him is trying to balance the fact that, look, the Rockets certainly understand the modern NBA shot chart. They want him to be a volume shooter from 3, yet there are some nights and some defenses, depending on how they hedge against you, where it makes more sense to blow by, and especially as you get better understanding the angles that you can take. And that's what he was really good at tonight, really just knifing his way through that Boston defense and finishing not just the easy ones. He actually did blow a dunk, but he had so many tough little floaters or, layups that he had to put high off the backboard. I'd say in that 3 to 5 foot range that are just so much tougher, especially against a team that does have rim protection like the Celtics and a lot of length all over the floor. I think sometimes we talk about Jalen so much physically just because we know how skinny he looked coming out as a 19-year-old prospect a year ago. But I think some of it is mental as well, his development. He's trying to find the right time to, say, hey, this is a night that I need to put up, the 12, 13 threes, the high volume that they believe I need to and can eventually be to score 30 points per game at this level, with then going back to just some of the old school basketball instincts of, hey, if they're hedging on me, this tightly on the perimeter, then this is a team that I need to be comfortable driving and taking the appropriate angle against and getting an easier bucket inside. And I think that's an underrated part of his adjustment. It's not just physical, but mental as well. And I think, these last 2 games, we've talked a ton this year about Jalen's struggles on the road. It's great to see him have 2 great games in a row on the road against teams that I know the Bulls are below 500, but they've won 3 straight games or had one going into that game last night. The Celtics are the best team in the NBA, and Jalen looked good in both. I think it shows his mental strength and bouncing back from his road struggles. And I also think it shows that he's sort of mentally adjusting to the concept of taking what the defense gives him.
Coming up, we're going to shift gears and focus on the point guard play from this game. Kevin Porter Jr. with another phenomenal outing, 22 points, 9 assists, not a single turnover in this one. And then also off the Rockets bench, their new backup point guard, TyTy Washington, seemingly having replaced Daisha Nix in the Rockets rotation. A big night for TyTy, 10 points, 5 boards, 3 assists in 20 minutes off the Rockets bench. We're going to get there, but first, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Next game, I'm taking Jalen Green to score more than 24.5 points. What about KPJ to have more than 7.5 assists? How about Alperen Sengun more than 8.5 rebounds? That sounds like a pretty solid, reasonable number. And what about Jabari Smith Jr.? Look, he's been struggling, so I think I'll stay safe. I'll say less than 3.5 3-pointers for Jabari Smith Jr. Look, what is Prize Picks? How does it work? Basically, you pick 2 to 6 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 25 times back on your money on any entry that you submit. No competing against other people. It's just you versus the projections available. Prize Picks offers projections on any sport that you watch. That's NBA, NFL, NHL, PGA, college, you name it. They've got you covered over at Prize Picks. Entries can be made in 60 seconds or less. It's that simple. Download the Prize Picks app or go to prizepicks.com to sign up to play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. If you deposit $50, Prize Picks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter promo code LOCKEDON at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, appreciate you for making Locked On Rockets your first listen every day. Make sure to go check out Locked On Sports today for your second listen. The biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less, plus instant reactions, game recaps, and Locked On's take of the day. Locked On Sports today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Now, Ben, you mentioned there in segment 1, KPJ being, extra locked in since the news surfacing that James Harden may be coming back to Houston. I mean, look, if you saw potential, even hypothetical writing on the wall that somebody was going to be coming back to potentially take your spot in the Rockets rotation, to take your job away from you, of course you're going to kind of hone in a little bit and really focus in on your craft to make sure you are, on your best behavior, whatever, putting your best foot forward, all those different expressions that we can use. And Kevin Porter Jr. did that in this game and has done that since that report came out. But against the Celtics, 22 points, 8 of 18 shooting. Yeah, 8 of 18 shooting. I can't read. Had 5 boards, 9 assists, and then the 0 turnovers. And really what stood out in this game to me is it almost felt kind of like the inverse of the Bulls game, where in the Bulls game, Jalen had the big first half, and then KPJ stepped up big in the second half, right? And then this one was the flip, where KPJ was on fire in the first half, really kind of doing a lot of the heavy lifting for the Rockets offensively, because
keep them afloat.
Keep them afloat, and it was working. And then kind of calmed down a little bit there in the second half, but the playmaking really stood out as well, where he is doing such a good job of finding guys, making solid reads, playing well in the pick and roll. Like it seems like all these things that we've been kind of clamoring for all season for Kevin have now started to come together. And I know it's just 2 games. That's it. He had a couple games earlier this season, like against the Raptors, that little stretch where he was really good with facilitating the ball and then kind of waned again. So it remains to be seen if he's able to keep this going over a long stretch. But I think you've got to be really, really impressed with, again, the 9 dimes to 0 turnovers. That's huge for him.
Yeah, and I was really encouraged by his post-game comments in Chicago. We had the Jonathan Fagan story about the ball movement, because in the Dallas loss, they basically only lost that game because Luka went for 50. Overall, they played well. And in those 2 games, the close Dallas loss and the win at Chicago, where they won with ease, they averaged 27 assists per game. For some perspective, would be top 5 in the NBA for the whole season, whereas they actually ranked dead last for the year at less than 22. So it's a huge uptick in their performance. And after the game, multiple guys, Kevin, Jalen, Alperen Sengun, they all talked about this idea that it's not just about the ball movement. It's about how when everybody touches the ball, it benefits them in so many ways in terms of guys being more bought in collectively. Sengun talked about it making him play harder defensively as well. And so it's not just about a given possession. It's also about how engaged these guys are throughout the entire game. And so Kevin, as the point guard, he is sort of the ringleader in that regard, especially on the court. And I like the fact that they took ownership. And one of the quotes, he says, I'm the point guard. I know it starts with me. And ultimately, I feel like, and I don't know how much of this is fair, but a lot of the Rockets fan base, especially on Twitter, there's this idea that the Rockets have perhaps babied Kevin Porter Jr. a bit too much in terms of just, we've heard the criticism, whether it's been against Steven Silas, Rafael Stone, that the Rockets just have too much investment in KPJ, that they're too, just overwhelmingly supportive. When in reality, in the NBA, of course, there's going to be adversity. And the question is, how do you respond to that adversity? This is just 2 games, but I do think that this perhaps lends some credence to the idea that, maybe it is better if you have a bit of a balance, because this is perhaps the first time this season when it hasn't all been sunshine and roses in terms of the statements. Now, it's not that the Rockets themselves leaked the Harden report, but what I'm saying is that it's something in the discourse that they read that's from a credible reporter that is not, just reaffirming the idea that we're invested in Kevin Porter Jr. as the point guard. And so the fact that he took that, and, I know it was a theory from Tim McMahon, but it's hard not to see it on the court. It certainly feels like he's channeled that in a positive way. And I think that's a good sign. And perhaps it, not saying that you should be mean to him all the time. It's a balance. You certainly want to show that you love and support him. But I do think that maybe, and this is part of the maturation process as well, he's now 22 years old, year 4. Maybe it's time to take the kid gloves off a little bit. And it's okay to be, measured in our criticism, because this is a good sign. He's responded well. Again, it's only 2 games. I know that's, right after, and it's a road trip, but it is a very small sample in the grand scheme. But tip your hat to the guy. He seems very dialed in. I'm sure if you ask him, he'll say it's not correlated with that. He'll say that, he's been in the film room and they had the extra days off over Christmas and it takes time and it's constantly adjusting, yada, yada. And there's probably some truth in that. They're always, big picture focused. But in the short term, I do think it's a little bit of a kick in the pants, and it's a good sign. We saw at times last year, Christian Wood did not always respond the best way when some of those things happened. It feels like this year, in a year that's similarly, make or break in terms of what is his role long-term for the Rockets. Yeah, to me, it's a good sign that he's, he hasn't let the adversity of the storyline since that Harden bombshell Christmas morning really shake him in any way. If anything, it might be inspiring him, because these have been, in my opinion, it's been clearly his best back-to-back games of the entire season. I think that's absolutely fair to say. And it's hard not to think that, perhaps there wasn't a little bit of extra incentive going into this.
Here at Locked On Rockets, we are big supporters of bullying. Bullying works. It really does. This goes back to the bubble season, and it's just like this running joke, right? You start complaining about a certain player on Twitter and they're not XYZ, and then it turns it around. So maybe it's working here for Kevin Porter Jr., the indirect bullying by, the idea that James Harden might come back to take his spot. And I do think this one of the things really stood out to me from this game, Ben, is the staggering. And we've been on the, do they stagger him? Do they not stagger him? Steven Silas talking about the analytics department. They haven't seen any, noticeable advantage to not staggering versus staggering, whatever, right? It felt like in this game, when Kevin was out there, and when Kevin is out there with that secondary bench unit where it's Kevin and then any combination thereof of Garuba or Bruno and Tari and KJ and, Garrison and TyTy in this one, basically when he's out there and he is the go-to offensive force, and there's not another dynamic guy out there like Jalen or like maybe Alp, guys who you feel like should also be sharing in the offensive reps of the team. I feel like Kevin is almost at his best when that is the case, because then it's just like, okay, he goes out there and he knows it's his job to go get a bucket. And Jalen, we've talked about this before, Jalen also looks really good when he's out there and it's just like Jalen and the Goon Squad and then like either Daishen Nix or TyTy Washington, because then Jalen understands he's got to be the offensive force for the team. There's no second guessing himself. There's no, okay, I can't go, so you've got some time left on the clock. Now you try. There's no your turn, my turn. It's just those guys understand that the buck starts and stops with them when it's just them on the floor. And so in this game, the staggering between Jalen and KPJ, I thought was really successful. And I really did like how Steven Silas used KPJ at the top of the second quarter. And then also Jalen played a little bit at the top of the fourth quarter, but then Kevin Porter Jr. came back in early in that quarter and then kind of KPJ getting these like rests with, a few minutes left in the second quarter, a few minutes left in the fourth before coming back in to try and close out the game. I like how Silas is now balancing that rotation between those guys.
I also think that TyTy Washington, who had 10 points and 3 assists in 20 minutes, shot well from 3, 2 of 5 on the night. I think there's some subtle ways in which TyTy over Nix can benefit Kevin. For starters, you referenced when Kevin's out there with the second units, depending on how they choose to stagger. We've talked about it before, but those lineups with both Nix and Garuba are just really, really clunky, especially if Eason's out there too. Now, Eason, lately has shot really well, but it's taken him until the last few games for him to really trust that shot. Now you can see him starting to fire it away a bit more willingly. But Nix, even when the percentages were good, you can tell he just does not trust his three-point shot. And with Usman Garuba, it is what it is. And those lineups get really, really clunky, the spacing in a hurry. And so it's just a classic scenario of asking Kevin Porter Jr. to do too much. The flip side, depending on if he's resting in that, and I think, the low light of the season, in my opinion, was that Orlando game a week ago Wednesday when they had the 15-point lead midway through the second half and then just could not do anything against that zone, looked completely inept. And, when the game was really getting away from them midway through the fourth quarter, I remember that 2-minute stretch that Kevin, Jalen, and Sengun were all at the scorer's table, and Silas should have called a timeout. I suspect in hindsight, he wishes he had. He was hoping he can get the automatic one. It didn't happen, and the Magic, pulled away from what was basically like a 2-point game either direction to, I think they had a big 3 and got it up to 5 or 6. And by that point, Kevin Porter Jr. came back in after the timeout, but so much damage had been done. That lineup was struggling so much, especially on offense, that those guys coming in sort of feel like they have to be Superman to sort it out, as opposed to when you have someone that's a bit more stable like TyTy Washington. And, again, it's multiple ways. If Kevin's out there, then okay, it's a shooter. It's someone that can at least be functional in terms of, spacing the floor and making defenders respect where he is at a given moment. But also, if Kevin's not on the floor, then it makes it, in my opinion, less likely that you're going to have just really the bottoming out scenarios that you had when Nix was really, really bad. And I think that if you avoid that, then maybe you avoid some of the temptation of, what we saw in the Orlando game, which, by the way, culminated in like 5 turnovers in the last 5 minutes of that game, many of them just mind-numbingly bad. Not all KPJ. It was really a collective meltdown, let's be honest there. But I think some of that is brought on by just how bad those Knicks-led units were, as opposed to now, if TyTy is functional, then there's a trickle-down effect to where it can perhaps have a calming influence on not just the guys he's playing with, but also the overall rotation, because you don't have that huge zero that we have at times this year in Dacian Nix.
We're going to call it trickle-down TyTynomics. How's that? Coming up, we're going to talk about, final thoughts, takeaways from this game, as well as take a look at kind of the struggles of Alperen Sengun and also Jabari Smith Jr. in this one. We're going to get there, but first, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline.net is your number one source for all of your sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis this season. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there, from pro football, college bowl season, basketball, NFL. They've got you covered for everything over at BetOnline. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get all of your sports betting info. And right now, you can head over to BetOnline to learn more about the number one pick odds in this year's NBA draft. And spoiler alert, Victor Wembanyama is still the favorite to go number one overall at minus 1,200 to go number one overall in this year's draft. But here's the funny thing. The next closest, the next best odds maker to go number one in the draft is not Scoot Henderson. It's actually the other category at plus 700. So anybody not named Scoot Henderson has a better chance to go number one overall. And the Scoot Henderson is plus 1,600 to be the number one overall selection in this year's NBA draft. So for all those odds and more, be sure to visit betonline.net to learn more about the trends and action available to you. BetOnline, it's where the game starts. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Now, before getting, into some of the actual downsides from this game, which was, I think, the production that you saw out of, or I guess lack thereof, out of Alperen Sengun and Jabari Smith Jr., just taking a quick, glance at, this Boston Celtics team, it's really tough to beat the Celtics team. There's a reason they're so, so potent this season. They have this, insane mix of offensive talent. Obviously, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown combining for 77 points here. The defensive, impact that they have. So many switchable guys, so many guys who are competent guarding, punching above their weight class, I guess, in, some of the switches that were happening with Alperen Sengun, which I did think kind of took him. The Celtics they did a good job taking Alperen Sengun kind of out of the game, I thought, on switches. But I don't think it was exclusively that. I don't want to give all the credit to the Celtics. I do think that there were moments early in this game where Sengun would have the seal on a smaller guy like Marcus Smart or whatever on a switch, and the Rockets were looking to get him involved and then just couldn't quite get him that entry pass, or they bobbled a few entry passes. Jalen Green had, those 3 turnovers really early in the game, which I think kind of discouraged them from that point on early in the game to kind of making some of those entry passes, because Alperen Sengun was doing the job of kind of creating those seal off opportunities and getting a good seal in the paint, and he just wasn't getting the ball in some of those situations. It's not like he was getting it repeatedly and turning the ball over or missing shots. It's just it's such a weird stark contrast from how involved he was and felt in the Bulls game to then this game, where some of it is definitely the Celtics doing a good job, smaller guys fronting him, switching, whatever. But I do think, the Rockets have to find ways to keep him involved, because they just look so much better when he is involved.
Well, and again, as I was mentioning earlier, I think some of it too is that when he does get the matchup against a big, it's the type of bigs with Horford and Robert Williams that they're just very high IQ. Again, a lot of Şengün's game.
Great defenders.
Yeah, I mean, they're great defenders and they're very heady. And a lot of Şengün's game at this point is really, because he's so smart, using guys' athleticism against them, getting them to sort of overly hedge in one direction and commit too early. And, this is, these are guys that are just as smart as Sengun, but they have way more experience. So it's just, especially on the road, it's a tough matchup. The one thing I will say, though, in terms of, the lack of shot attempts, because he played nearly 25 minutes and shot only 3 times. No, he didn't make any of them, but that's, staggeringly low for sure. That's a fair thing to acknowledge. One thing I think the Rockets need to perhaps do a bit better is determine a hierarchy, because right now what it feels like is from game to game, really Jalen is the only guy who, even if it doesn't start well for him, he's going to keep firing, because again, he's the established guy. More than anything that's happening with the 2022 to 23 Houston Rockets, it's about Jalen Green. He is the most important guy in the organization, and everybody knows it. After Jalen, it gets a little tricky in that, if someone starts off in which it doesn't look like it's really their game, then sometimes it can be tough. I mean, Kevin, because he's the point guard, it doesn't apply quite as much to him because he always has the ball in his hands. And so that naturally lends itself to a bit more opportunities. But especially when we're looking at, the guys like certainly Sengun, but also Jabari, I would throw Eric Gordon into this mix as well. Many times it feels like you can determine after the first 6 to 8 minutes how many shot attempts they're going to have in a given game, because you just sort of feel like it just get the sense, is this a friendly matchup for them or not, based on, I guess, number one, who they're going up against, do they have it going on a given night, just all the various, night to night factors that are out there. And from a process standpoint, especially with your younger guys like LP, I think you would like to see a bit more sort of stick-to-itiveness, in that even if it doesn't go your way early in the game, don't just collectively say, well, this isn't a good matchup for him, go at it again the second quarter. And maybe, by that point, especially if Jalen has it going, or in this case, it was KPJ that had it going in the first half tonight, then maybe that sort of changes how the defense looks at it as a team. And maybe when they're making their adjustment to do more things against the guards, maybe that's the time to start running more offense through LP. But to me, that's sort of the thing to push back on, is the outside of Jalen, it feels like it's just very much from night to night, who has it going early, and then just sort of ride those hot hands. And of course, Sengun had it going early in Chicago. They went through him, whereas in Boston, he didn't. And I think it's especially tough for Sengun too, because the Rockets are still trying to play 3 centers. And so if it starts to look bad early, if it's not just one alternative with Usman Garuba, but also you're trying to play both Usman and Bruno, then it makes it really tough to get to the minutes that a guy like Sengun probably needs to get comfortable. It's very easy when you're trying to play 3 centers to not have anybody go above, 22, 23 minutes, because it's just so tough to sort of juggle all of that. That's one of the downsides to it. And so I think all of that comes together. But it is a fair criticism of the Rockets. Outside of Jalen, I don't think that there's necessarily again, I don't know the right word. I just said stick-to-itiveness earlier, but it just sort of feels like from game to game, it varies a lot based on who has the right hand. And sometimes you may want to, have more mixing it up from quarter to quarter within a given game.
Absolutely. I think that Chicago game was like the perfect template of just how you can buoy, the offense through utilizing Sengun and Jabari, and kind of not necessarily, I guess it's more so you don't play through Jabari, but just involving those guys a bit more, getting their attempts up, kind of getting them some reps early in the game so they can get into their flow rather than going significant stretches of the game where they're not touching the ball or not even getting shots up, that kind of thing. Because it felt like Sengun was taken out of this game early and never really got a chance to get even in rhythm as the game went along. Again, 3 shot attempts is just absurd. This is the first time that Sengun has been held to 0 points as a starter in his Rockets career, which I thought was kind of crazy to think about.
And I also thought he got a little bit discouraged by, Boston, not just defensively, but offensively as well, the amount of off-ball movement that they do. And you were talking about how great the Celtics are. And when they are dialed in my opinion, they're clearly the NBA's best team. And you think about them being in the finals a year ago and a relatively young team outside of Al Horford, they brought back basically the entire core and then added Malcolm Brogdon, a really good player. Tonight had 8 assists in 21 minutes, and they will punish you if you make any mistakes at all. And I think Sengun's a guy that defensively, you can see from game to game, he's trying to get better, but we know the limitations are real athletically. He doesn't have the ability to sort of recover when he's beaten the way a lot of other bigs do. So it can be difficult against this kind of matchup that will really seek out any weakness you have and punish you for it, because unlike a lot of bigs, he just doesn't have the athleticism to really recover. And the final point I'd throw out, I do wonder too if Sengun might have been just a little bit fatigued. I think a lot of these guys are so young, but with Sengun, we know it's been a work in progress with his body these last couple of years. That's something the Rockets cited a year ago when they were very slow in building up his minutes, was not just about the fouling, but also his overall stamina. And so coming off a game in Chicago less than 24 hours earlier, where he was super high usage, perhaps his most high usage game to date in terms of how impactful he was, not just as a scorer, as a passer, as a rebounder, so many elements of the game, his defense as well. I wonder if he also was just a little bit gassed tonight, even more than the others, because again, it's a bit of an unfair comparison because again, with bigs, it's tougher than for a guard like Jalen or KPJ, but it's just a bit tougher on his body. And so he might've been a little bit more gassed than the guards were on the second night of this road back-to-back.
Yeah, up and down the entire roster. I mean, so many of especially the starters, obviously Eric Gordon not playing this game, just the resting, the groin maintenance, whatever the Rockets are labeling it. He just doesn't play back-to-backs. And so played last night, didn't play this game. All the starters played less minutes than they did in against the Bulls. Definitely, one of those things where, maybe you look at the minutes distribution, how heavily Silas leaned on some of these bench guys. Garrison Matthews with 17 off the bench. Even Josh Christopher getting the nod with 8 minutes off the Rockets bench in this game. Yeah, so I mean, that's definitely, I think, a factor to consider here. Again, hard-fought game against a very, very good Boston Celtics team. Last guy here, Ben, Jabari Smith Jr., who just, he had that stretch where he was just looking really, really good, where he was sinking everything. The confidence is there on the shot. I still think the confidence is there, but at the same time, you see him in this game, 6 points, 9 rebounds, had a couple of assists, did have 4 turnovers. I felt like he had way too many moments in this game, I feel like, where he was trying to do too much. And I think this was kind of like what we saw earlier in the season where he was pressing a little bit. The credit to the Celtics defense for like at times running him off the 3-point line, forcing him into some of these, tough drives and awkward finishes around the rim. He did have 3 shots at the rim, I should say 3 shots inside the arc and a couple of them at the rim that he just completely smoked. And those were the moments where you're like, come on, man, like really, like you're right there 6 inches away from the rim. You gotta know how to like just finger roll the ball in and not like brick it off the back of the iron.
Right. I mentioned in the first segment that in general, I'm less alarmed by his recent struggles because a lot of it's just 3-point randomness that happens to anybody early in the year. Again, that shot chart in the Bulls game was just so jarring and also encouraging because you could see the ascent from month to month. Tonight, outstanding because he was 0 for 3 inside the 3-point arc, 2 of 10 overall, 2 of 7 on threes. But yeah, like 18% in October, mid 30s in November, around 50% in December. So he has been getting better inside the arc. A lot of it is that mid-range game. We've seen him do a lot of damage, I would say in the 14, 15 foot range, just getting more comfortable using his body to create a little bit of separation. And then of course, with his length, it does not take much separation at all for him to get a clean look off and be able to bury it. Yeah, the next step is going to be, just getting more natural with his touch around the basket. And perhaps, there's a bit more contact there in the mid-range. If there's any contact in the mid-range, it's going to stand out as opposed to around the bucket. Inherently, it's going to be a bit more physical, not just upper body, but lower body as well. Perhaps that takes some more strength and also just getting used to that level of contact, which is certainly very different than the college game. Again, in the macro, I'm not that worried about it because unlike early in the year when he looked like sort of a fish out of water, anything inside the arc and just trying to basically be a much more athletic Matt Bullard in terms of spacing the floor. Now he looks very comfortable.
Whoa. The disrespect to Rockets legend Matthew Bullard. How dare you, Ben?
I know. Sorry. I think Matt would understand, though, given the talent of Jabari Smith Jr. I hope he would take that as...
Look, we call Matt Air Bullard for a reason, okay?
That's true.
We haven't called him Air Jabari yet.
That's true. Fair point. Yeah, early in Bull's career, he had some low-key athleticism that people forget. Like the first 3 or 4 years where he started having some knee issues. Yeah, if you look back on YouTube, you'll see some crazy Bullard dunks that will actually blow your mind, given what most of us remember from, the championship era and beyond into the late 1990s and early 2000s. But yeah, with Jabari, the point is he's gotten more comfortable inside the three-point arc. So much of his struggles, again, I looked into it. The game logs haven't updated as we're recording this shortly after the game, but he was basically at 20% from three in his last 6 games. He was barely better than that tonight at like 28%. So he's basically very low 20s, about 21% over his last 7 games. That's a funk. That's going to normalize with time. He's still confident, as you mentioned earlier. He's taking those shots. He did have 9 rebounds, by the way, which led the team and the Rockets overall, 49 boards compared to 49 for the Celtics. That's a draw. I mean, they've been winning a lot of rebounding battles lately, but against a team like Boston at home that prides itself on defense, with you perhaps being a little tired on night 2 of back-to-back, that's a good showing. It shows you that he's comfortable, that he's certainly not shying away from the contact and letting it affect his effort. He's still shooting. He's aggressively attacking the glass. Again, it's not a mentality thing. It's just about, number one, you want to see some more threes go through the basket. And then as far as the ones inside, honestly, I mean, you've just got to keep taking those shots and eventually get used to how it feels. Because again, it's not just shooting them in an empty gym, which I'm sure he's practicing that plenty when the Rockets go through shoot around and it practices, yada, yada, but shooting it with the type of pressure and contact that, especially on the road, you're going to feel in the NBA, and that's just going to come with time. So it's frustrating. But again, the fact that it isn't affecting his other areas the way it did early in the season, and perhaps some of the early season was his ankle too. He did sprain that in the preseason. So in fairness to him, it could be that. But again, so much of it now, we would feel a lot better about Jabari. If he makes, if he shoots 4 of 7 from 3 tonight, we're having a fairly different conversation and saying, this is a pretty encouraging night in which he's, put up, 12 and 9 or 14 and 9 on decent efficiency.
And was also being tasked with chasing Jason Tatum around the court.
Yeah,
that
too. Yeah, he takes on a much larger responsibility than most 19-year-olds do defensively. And of course, he wants that. That's a good sign as well. He's not shying away from it. I just think a lot with Jabari is that if his shooting comes around, the other elements of his game, like the finishing in traffic and through physical contact, we knew that was going to be a struggle. We knew that was going to take time, and there's no real way to get that other than experience. It's just we're getting a bit more anxious about that now because the threes aren't falling. So to me, the best short-term fix is just keep him shooting threes, keep having the shooting coaches, if there's any hitch in his mechanics, try and iron that out when you have off days like they will on Wednesday. Because if he gets the threes, that's going to make it a lot easier for us to sort of just be patient with the other elements of his game that we knew were ultimately going to take a bit longer to come around.
Much more competitive game against the Boston Celtics than I think any of us were anticipating coming into the night.
Or that the final score would indicate.
That too, right? Final score 126-102, 24-point deficit. This Rockets team was right there, kind of knocking on the door of making this a game in the fourth quarter against the Celtics before Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown just, took things over late down the stretch in this one. But Ben, you know the drill. Let everybody know where they can track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Rockets Wire on Twitter, the Logger Line on Twitter, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all of your daily Houston Rockets coverage.
And that's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcast. That's Apple, Spotify, Google, the Odyssey app, free and available on all podcast platforms. We're also available on YouTube. Just go to YouTube, search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.